Oh, yeah. Welcome to the bonus episode of the Permaculture P.I.M.P.cast, where PIMP stands for Permaculture is my passion. The only P.I.M.P.cast on planet Earth where we discuss permaculture, preparedness, practical living, and a great many other things, as you well know. Second time out, I'm on here with a guest that I've been wanting to listen to for quite a while, or actually have a conversation with. Seems like he and I have a lot in common. We tried this recording a moment ago, and it stopped right at about 2:36 into the recording inexplicably. We prayed together. Nathan led us in prayer, and here we are. So no weapon formed against us is going to prosper. You dig? So, folks, I've talked about it before. I've talked about my past. Didn't give you the whole story, but I told you that my mom, back in the day, almost certainly, first in West Virginia and then later on in Oklahoma, while incarcerated, was probably under the direct control of Louis Jolly and West. You've heard me talk about people like Russ Dizdar. You heard me talk about a lot of the other people out there that have gone a long way. People like Craig Sawyer, who have Vets for Child Rescue. People like Bear Independent, who are running the Caleb House down in Oklahoma. In fact, we're not only have we raised a lot of funds for some of these people, but in addition to that, we're working, designing food forests right now for recovery centers that are being built by Caleb House. So, folks, when you buy some of this stuff out here, a lot of it, a fair amount of it, goes to these causes. We don't talk about it much, but look, y'all, anybody here knows how near and dear it is to my heart. Good night, the children are, and the dreadful, diabolical things that are happening in this world to them. A guest right now is somebody who's lived through a lot of that stuff, has a story that will absolutely blow your mind, and I have no doubt that it is absolutely true. So with that said, y'all, I want to bring on Nathan Reynolds. How you doing, Nathan?
Doing absolutely marvelous. Thanks so much for having me on, Billy.
No, it's a joy to have you. I heard your story a while back. I want to give a hat tip to my friends over at the P.I.M.P.cast. I forgot to put on that hoodie, but it's as hot and it's blazing up here tonight in the studio, so I don't necessarily want to put that on. But thanks, Raul and Alex, for having Nathan on, and thank you for setting him up with me. Nathan, bro, you got an unbelievable story for those that don't know, and you happen to be into permaculture as well. It seems like you and I have a great deal in common. So every good superhero has an origin story. So why don't you tell us yours, bro? And you take as long as you like. You take the reins here. And folks, I'm warning you right now, if you're on your way to work, you're probably going to be late, because I'm telling you what, he is going to drop a tactical nuke of information on your head right now. So take it away, Nathan.
Thanks again, Billy, for having me here. Yes, so for those of you who have not heard my story before, I came out about 6 years ago for the first time ever sharing more publicly what I went through, because I was born into a family that all of my life I'd been conditioned to believe was normal. And it really wasn't until later on when I met my wife and got married to her that all of these pieces of this puzzle of what had been my past began to start really coming unglued. And I began to see a great disparity between the life that she had lived. She was raised in a normal middle-class American Christian home. And as I began to share with her some of the stories of what normalcy was, what my Thanksgiving dinners were like, what my holidays were like during the summer, she began to look at me with this face of just disgust, a face of confusion, a face of horror, as I began to share with her what I thought was normal relationships, what I thought what family meant. And it became more and more evident as we began to get to know each other over the course of the beginning of our marriage, that what I had gone through and what I'd experienced could not have been more contrasting, could not have been more farther from what any child, what any young man should ever experience as life, as love, as authenticity. And it shattered me so inexplicably to the deepest portion of my being. And it took me years of trying to go through and weigh into this darkness of my despair from my past, because my family on the surface lived a very average lifestyle. My family, I've come from the Reynolds family, and down in southern Arizona, where my family began to kind of establish themselves, they began to build out an empire. And so I come from generational wealth, a type of wealth, though, that's not just given to you because you are born into the family. It's a type that's earned, and it's earned through a process of proving yourself and proving allegiance to a type of profiteering that most people would find utterly detestable, deplorable, where the profiteering is done through children. And so my family utilized child exploitation as a means to gain access to power and compromise other individuals so that they themselves could be procurers of people's little black books, their dirty little secrets. And the Reynolds family that I come from is not the Reynolds aluminum family that people are as familiar with. My family were the traffickers of secret. They made black gold, is what you would call it, a way of generating funds that are not on the books. And the way that was done is secrecy. And so down in southern Arizona, there's this city. It's called Lake Havasu City, Arizona. And it was founded back in the 1960s by a guy named Robert P. McCulloch. And he literally originally stated that he wanted to found this city to be able to do MK experiments out on a lake that was dammed up. The Colorado River down there is dammed up. It's one of the hottest places in the entire United States. And he began to build out a retirement community. So it was kind of brokered, and he offered free flights to potential clients to come out and be able to buy out plots. And he began to work with a guy named C.V. Wood, who was the founder and the architect of Disneyland. And he was utilized by Walt Disney to build out these kind of pleasure island and these experiments and rides that people are familiar with, and a lot of the underbelly of Disneyland, which facilitates a lot of the trafficking side of life that I became very intimately familiar with. And so they designed a pleasure island out there and brought over the London Bridge, the literal London Bridge from the city of London that goes over the River Thames. And when they were bringing that bridge over, they uncovered something that was practiced over there in the London Bridge, which is called inurement. Inurement is where people who follow these ancient religions, as many of you are aware, there's people who genuinely believe that they can talk to other spirits, and the way that they do that is through the sacrifice and the entombing of children as they're doing that. And this is something that's gone all the way back to the Canaanite religions, and as a way of punishing other people too, to give power over to a state, was to get them to sacrifice their child into the walls of the building. And so even mainstream historians tell you that they found 80 bodies, 5 of which were children, in the walls of the London Bridge as they were bringing that building over here. And so my normal life went through an absolute shattering early on, very early on. From some of my first memories, my family would take me down to Lake Havasu City, Arizona. I was born in a place called Flagstaff, Arizona, but we would travel down there to my grandfather. And he was a Fourth Order Knight of the Knights of Columbus. And him, along with a lot of these brothers of the Jesuit order, have a child exploitation trafficking network. And the key tenet of that is radical abuse of children. But it's never, I can't express this enough. They look at it as if it's a product line. They look at it as if every aspect of this entire process should be profiteered from. So there's no aspect of it that goes to waste. So in the course of the beginning formative years of it, there's a breaking period where they literally just psychologically, physically, sexually traumatize you. They shatter any resiliency you ever have to fight back, anything you ever knew about what your identity should be, what you'd hope for. All of it gets shattered. All of it gets taken from you. Every form of innocence you could ever hope for is obliterated through the pleasure of psychopaths, people that want to have access to children, have a legal sovereign territory there in Lake Havasu City. The city of London gave the bridge to Robert P. McCulloch, but part of that was a clause that they would have a legal sovereign territory, just like the Vatican is a legal sovereign territory. The District of Columbia is also a legal sovereign territory, and same with the city of London. It's not part of Great Britain. It's its own autonomous entity. And similarly, it has what would be like an ambassador's embassy over here in the United States. And so it gives them a form of immunity. And this is literally where these hotels and these trafficking networks built themselves out back in the late 60s and the early 70s. And when I went in there in the early 1990s, it was up and running and very profitable. And so I went through an absolute destroying of my identity. And it was a systemic, intentional shattering of my soul to create a dissociative state, to create fractured and alter identities, to utilize and weaponize something that I believe our Creator, God, as I've always known him, he gave us this gift of dissociation when we experience traumas that are so unsurvivable, unpalatable. He gives us the ability to separate ourselves from it, and to create but a safe space within, a separate part of our body to go through that, and our soul to go through that. The problem is people with dark neuroscience, people who have weaponized this form of what used to be an occultic tactic, have now engineered a form of doing this very scientifically, and they then utilize that, and at the same time they pair it with a lot of occult rituals, and it becomes a very sadomasochistic, destructive means of creating undetectable mind-controlled slaves, for lack of a better word. And so I went through this very early on, and it created in me this great pattern of duplicity between what my normal life was on one side, where my family would go back. We were Christians. We were very active in the church. My family were participants in the church on an ongoing basis. It was a great camouflage. Nobody really suspected a thing for all intents and purposes, but there was these clues along the ways. My family would shuffle me around and move me from school to school to school. I had 2 older sisters, but they were not brought into the same thing. My family utilizes a grandfather to do predominantly the majority of the abuse, whereas the child never bonds or attaches properly, so it shifts around. And this kept going on and on in my life until my early years. They finally started to identify, really, I wanted revenge. I wanted justice. I wanted more than anything else. I didn't need it to stop for me, because I'd felt like I was so defiled. I was convinced I could never get out, but I wanted it to stop for somebody else, because I knew I'd witnessed how one abuser, one guy with this pedophilia, could have 100 victims. Like, I can't even describe it enough. One person will commit these atrocities if they are not arrested or killed. And so they began to train me up into this dark arts of killing, the arts of death, the arts of violence, and began to allow me to go after people who they would lead me to believe were the perpetrators, were the pedophiles. And for them, it was a win-win, because it was oftentimes people that they wanted out of the organization, out of the brotherhood. But for me, it was like a way to release that rage, that need for vengeance, a need to just stop it from happening to somebody else. And so I finally began to get some levels of an outlet of freedom, but only through these little channels. And so my youth became consumed with violence. It became consumed with hatred and with a need to stop this. And it just boiled over into my teenage years and joining the military, and ravaged my life for so much of it. But over time, the Father began to orchestrate a way out for me. And really, that's some of those things that I also like to talk about, as dark as it is. And we can talk as much as you want about those early years. We can also talk about the years where the Father began to do those divine deliverances in my life. But it has been an absolute journey of restoration to try to get to a place of even being able to speak about these things. But I've seen and witnessed now over the years, I've been speaking about this, hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of other people who suffered in so many similar ways as I did, family members of mine who went through these same very specific types of horror shows. And yet they are gaining their voices. They are getting an opportunity to speak out. And so the reason I come out here, the reason I speak, is to try to give my life away, to lay down my life, to give an opportunity to others who have gone through these things, a chance to come out, to speak the truth, to know that there are ways to get healing. There's a path of redemption that doesn't always require radical evil to get set free from.
Nathan, I got to ask, I mean, it sounds as if, by all appearances, anybody on the outside seems like, I mean, you said you guys were going to church in the whole 9 yards. By any bystander on the outside, they would probably assume that you guys were just a normal, everyday, all-American family. But inwardly, it seems like there was these horrors that were unfolding all at the same time. You mentioned going to church. I mean, how do you explain that duplicity? I mean, you have these evil things going on. And honestly, how many churches are full of people that, came from essentially the same back? I mean, I'll put it this way. I've been to a church recently, and it was Asheville. And there was a couple in particular that we suspect similar things might be going on. I'll leave it there for now. I could probably talk to you privately about some of the suspicions I have and why I have them. Paint this out for me a little bit, and for the people that are listening, what did this family? I mean, how were they able to cloak this?
Well, on one side of the equation, let me just put it to you super transparently. Satan has always been interested in infiltrating the church from the very most formative foundation points of it. He has weaponized people in order to infiltrate the church, because you never waste a bullet in a battle. And let me assure you of this. This is a real, ever-present danger. There is a real radical intelligent evil that is seeking to destroy all the things that relate to innocence, to authentic human experience. There is a predator who stalks us in the darkness and who devises schemes, who is scheming day and night for thousands of years. We are wrestling against immortals who are pouring out upon people intelligence so that they themselves can go and enact their will on this earth. And so when you have duplicity, like you're describing here, this is literally the children of the serpent here, who have shattered the mind of people to create on one side pure evil, a night walker is the way it's referred to, or a cult side, okay? On the other side, you will have all of the morality and the good Christian sides, and they embrace something that is a part of Luciferianism, whereas there is a form of worshiping the creator, the J.a.s.o.n, this grand architect of the universe, as they refer to him, the divine serpent that they believe set mankind free from this oppressive hand of our creator. And so because of that, they literally seek out to balance their deeds of evil with their deeds of good in so many ways. And so they take on this identity, and they take on this duality, where on one side, just like how you would see the Shriners, they have all these wonderful hospitals that are doing so much good to try to help children. On the other side, they are practitioners of this very type of trafficking network that is seeking to consume and exploit children. And so you're really dealing with an organized crime. You're dealing with people who on one side of this have a sincere feeling of authentic faith, of belief in this system, and on the other side are willing to hand over their children to perpetrators in order to grow in power and accolades. And that is something that a lot of people are going to have a really hard time holding in their hands, as this can be in one person. But you must understand, there is real darkness, demonic possession, where people are ruled by other things and they give themselves over. They sear their consciences with a hot iron. They literally swear oaths, these secrecy oaths. I'll tell you, it's one of the most dangerous things in all of society that are plaguing us is those that swear these oaths, because these oaths supersede all forms of constitutional oaths and any other type of oath they might have, whether they're at a church, whether they're your pastor. Even a lot of the Southern Baptist Church is infiltrated systemically with these Freemasons, people who swear these oaths where they will cover up the crimes of another brother, where they're willing to do these things. And if they forsake these oaths, they will cut out their tongues and rip up their stomachs and do all kinds of heinous, horrific acts. And these things really do get enforced. There's people who really enforce these oaths and they believe them sincerely. They see spiritual manifestations. They get foretelling from these other spirits that tell them things, that give them insights on how to deal with things. And so when you're going to a regular church, you must understand something. There is a very strategic infiltration in the vast majority of churches, and there are, by design, the ignorance of the people of God, the people of righteousness, is what is killing them. Yah says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. And this area is where the enemy likes to keep people most ignorant. It says we would not be deceived if we were ignorant of his schemes. The whole goal of the devil is to keep people ignorant of his schemes. As long as he does that, he has camouflage to continue to enact his vengeance on mankind. But if you come and learn about, hey, these are the tactics that your adversary uses in order to infest your church, you can learn to identify them. And like you said, I guarantee you are getting a gut feeling, an instinctive understanding of some of those telltale clues of multiplicity. Somebody that's not a single person. There's split personalities inside there, and you'll see some of these signs. There's fissures. Believe me, one of the key reasons my family moved around all the time is because cracks will start to appear. And people that have a gift of discerning spirits, or people that are also very empathetic and have an attunement to, maybe they had their house burned to the ground by a psycho at some point in their past. Maybe they had experienced, like you shared with your mom, being raised in a family with somebody who was already like this. Because you've experienced some of radical evil, I tell people it's like the fish hook in the jaw moment in your life, when everybody else is going on in normalcy, but you got ripped out of it because you saw behind the curtain and you knew with absolute certainty radical evil was real, and that there was people who conspired together to do wickedness for money, for power, for gains, for the exploitation of others. And so it gives you a different set of lenses with which to see each other. And the problem is, most people, when they go to church, they take those lenses off and they make a major assumption that the people are there are as they seem. But in reality, that is the place where they find the greatest camouflage, and they infiltrate predominantly the two arenas: children's ministry, and they infiltrate being close to the pastor and his wife. Those are the two places they like to be most, and often janitorial services. They want keys and access to the building, because you must understand these rituals and these horrible atrocities that were taking place, they were happening inside the church at times. My family would go inside Catholic churches to do these activities, to drink from a cup of blood. All of these horrible abuse of children would take place in churches to try to defile them, to try to curse them. And then the next day they would recycle out and go in as their kind of Christian form. And this takes place all over the country in various different denominations and forms. This is where our enemy likes to operate from, because it's where he can keep his adversaries, the people of righteousness, most suppressed.
You know, Nathan, I wish I could talk about nothing but permaculture. I really do. I mean, basically on the show, we talk about permaculture, preparedness, and practical living, and also weaved into all of that has always been my passion, and everybody in this audience knows about it, for children that are exploited and all these unthinkable things. And, frankly, in the United States of amnesia, nobody wants to have this conversation. Nobody wants to talk about these things that are going on. And that's why I wanted so badly to get you on this show, because I talk to a certain extent from arm's length about these things that I know about, that I know that are happening. I haven't been there firsthand. I don't know about these things firsthand, but you have, and you've been there. You've seen, the worst of the worst. I've been through part of your book, which, by the way, folks, you got to check it out, even his audio book. And you can check out his website, I think, snatchfromtheflames.com. And we'll link all of his contact information down below. But Nathan, let me take you back a little bit. I kind of got ahead of myself. So here you are growing up this way. You clearly have a grandfather that's a pedophile. And from what I've heard from other people that have been down this sort of thing, like Kathy O'Brien and a number of others out there, seems like this stuff is generational. Russ Dizdar, I think, has talked a great deal about that as well. I got to know, man, you have brother, I would imagine you got sisters, brothers. I can't recall. I know you have a sister or two, maybe. Have you cross-pollinated with them? Talk us through your awakening. Obviously, you were, for a time, I got to believe, a robot doing some of these things you were doing, because we got to eventually get to that point where you start, exacting justice your way. These other kids out there, were there other kids in this network? Did you know other kids that were involved in this? Your other family members? What were those conversations like, or did you even have them?
Later on, I did end up having a few of those conversations. I got to have one conversation with one of my sisters privately, and another one that got interrupted by my father when he found out where I was. And he did everything he can to shut that down, because once you start to unravel this family network, you got to understand this is still a family business from my family. And so when I started coming out and talking about this, it was bad for business, big time. And so the chaos ensued in no uncertain terms. But yes, there were other children that were involved in this, other family members of mine. However, my family, what the type of a cult, these people are they literally worship the serpent. I just got to put it super transparently for you guys. These people genuinely are these great, they literally believe in this brotherhood of the snake, and they are male cult. And so they utilize grandfathers and great grandfathers as the ones who perpetrate the abuse. So my sisters, I never had memories or times or experiences where my sisters were involved in any of this. They were around, they saw some of the signs and the symbols of these things, but we were also in a very captured environment, which is kind of like how a cult is able to maintain a lot of their anonymity, is because they only allow people that are co-experiencers of these things, so that should ever the child start talking about it, they have insulators so that they can find out, okay, they're breaking down about these areas. That kind of broken slave mentality is wearing off. So we need to kind of re-deepen a lot of the programming or deep persuasion to keep their mouths closed, because at the end of the day, their goal is to stay out of prison and stay out from being exposed, And so my grandfather was the main fomenter of that in my early years of my life. But then as I got a little bit older and into my early teen years, my great-grandfather on my father's side, he was the former president of the American Society of Civil Engineering. He was a deep Luciferian who was in charge of bringing in, the great architect of bringing in the complete reestablishment of the Statue of Liberty. For those of you that don't know, it is the statue that enlightens the world, this goddess of Columbia, truly a Masonic from its beginnings to its origins, the one who gave it to the sculptor who gave it to the Americans. This is a massive idol of the Masonic realm. And so he brought in and was able to orchestrate a lot of the redesign of its torch and started those practices. But he had a similitude of pedophilia towards little boys. And so he came in, and once he came in, my father got access to the trust fund. And this is literally how it works. If you want access to that trust fund, you got to be willing to sign over your child, your son, into that. And that's what my dad did. He compromised in a horrific and terrible way and moved an abuser into the house with me. And so for those early teenage years, I was trapped with him in the house. And this went on into my early teenage years until he died. And I was left as a shell of a young man, trying to find my identity, trying to find a purpose, and so lost, so confused. And really, like you said, this robotic lifestyle was completely up and running. You're programmed. You're living in a world where you never think you can break out of it, where everything is so compartmentalized. There's no normalcy. My mom was like a Stepford Wives robot. There wasn't a normal freedom in any capacity of my life. And so as I began to get groomed early and on in my teenage years, I began to get groomed to go into the United States military because I had this aptitude towards killing. I saw killing as the solution to this problem. Honestly, I thought the only way to stop this, I know there's lots of great networks out there of there's lots of strategies for how people are combating human trafficking, as we call it. Human trafficking is a good junk drawer term to cover a lot of bases of things like this level of human trafficking, as well as other levels of it. But there's lots of tactics on how to go about that. I really believed when I was young, the best way to do that was to kill the pedophile, to stop them, period. That was the most effective strategy. And so I got addicted to that form of killing. And in the United States military, I got emancipated to the United States government as a junior in high school through what's called the delayed entry program. And I got brought into what are really special access projects, where they have wet workers for special kill teams that go out. And I believed I was finally part of a team. I finally thought I had a sense of brotherhood of other guys that I could work with to go out and investigate and stop predators. And I had a brief taste of that for a small season in my life. But ultimately, what I saw inside the military was a similar form of corruption. It wasn't the occult stuff. It wasn't this brotherhood of the snake, but I still saw corruption. I still saw a brokenness inside what I had been raised to believe were our heroes. And many of them, I'm not trying to despair any veteran out there, any soldier out there who did what they were supposed to do, who did the right thing, who maintained their convictions, their morality, who did the right thing. But I saw behind the scenes a veil of trafficking and abuse of power inside the military that broke me of my hope, that broke me of what I believed in for so long, because I saw them capturing a portion of a trafficking ring and letting a huge portion of it go. I saw them sending me after targets who I believed were the pedophile, and come to find out instead they were one of their actors. They were one of their deep undercover agents who they said had flipped, but they hadn't, and they wanted to put their own guy inside. I saw so much compromise inside of the United States Army, and it devastated me. And for me, honestly, it was a death of my idol. It was where I'd put all of my hope. I had finally thought freedom was going to be found in this brotherhood of the military, and I was crushed. I was absolutely crushed. And I got out of the teams, and I got out of the United States military, and I ended up going to University of Colorado at Boulder and began studying psychology, because on one side of it, I just wanted to pick up the pieces of my brokenness. I wanted to heal myself, and I wanted to heal others. I wanted to put away the violence. I wanted to put away the death and try to heal and try to seek out what are the most effective strategies to put together somebody who is shattered. How do we put together healing when there has been such a systemic, deliberate destruction of the soul? And so that's really where a lot of my journey took a precipitous turn, because I got away from the cult. I began to get out of the military. I was finally able to get off all of the psychotropic medications that they shoved me on. And I began to think clearly. And I found a recovery program that was really open in arms to the broken. And they offered me an opportunity to be unwell, it was okay to not be okay. And I needed that as a deep, deep part of my life. And it began to show me a form of love and of relationships and of authenticity that I needed in order to begin to rebuild, for me, a foundation outside of these brotherhoods.
Now, walk me through that. You've been through some horrendous stuff. You go to the military just like I did. You get in there, think it's the cat's meow, realize, okay, it was better in the brochure in a lot of different ways. You get out of that, you find yourself in the regular world. At what point did you wake up? I mean, were you in a fog about all these things that had happened to you? Was there a demarcation point that said, oh, snap, I just woke up. Look what just happened to me. Walk me through that. How do you make that transition? And how did you even know? Because if you come from a family like mine, we put the funk in dysfunctional. I didn't know that we were unusual because everybody else around us was also dysfunctional. And you grew up in this environment with what you think is normal. What made you realize that, hey man, this ain't cool, this ain't normal? I mean, did you have a eureka moment?
I'll say this. The first major start, and like why I start out the book with sharing the story of meeting my wife Chelsea, was getting a foundation of love. Ultimately, I believed what I never truly understood was authentic love, unconditional love. My attachments to anything relating to love were so perverse for so long that it took me beginning to have a relationship with a woman who was outside of this, who could show me what love really was. And so she got married though to a very compartmentalized side of myself. I used to go, there was like half of me was this Nate, very happy, very lovey, very the world is only good all the time. But at night, or if I ever drank, or if I ever let the guard down, and just constant sorrow, those bleed through of memories and nightmares and terrors, and I mean, pissing and crapping myself in fear would come at me, And so I used to heavily medicate myself. Sex, drugs, and violence are like an intimate web that so many people get stuck in. Like, you get soul ties from having sexual partners, you get it from killing people too. And you get trapped in that world, especially if you never have an outlet for communicating it to other people. And so there was these depths of brokenness that she began to see in me that would come crawling out of the corners in the middle of the night, or scream fest in the middle of the night, waking up in cold sweats and grabbing a pistol. It was not normal. And she began to reflect to me, I think, in a lot of ways, something's not right here, honey. Like, it's what happened to you, what's going on in you is something that needs to come out, And she began to just create for me a bridge. Really, she just laid the foundation of building a bridge of communication that I fundamentally needed. But at the same time, and let me just put it super transparently, I got to experience men of boldness and courage standing up and talking about these things. That was my eureka moment. Let me tell you, Russ Dizdar, Steve Quayle, like these men were fundamentally critical. Dr. Michael Lake, critical for me to be able to come out, because they began to stand up and speak out on things that all my life I had been raised to believe they would be murdered for speaking about. Not just a little bit. Like, they would be made what's called a message to the masses, where they would cut this person apart, rip his tongue out, choke him. I mean, they would kill him in the most violent and horrific way to send a message to everyone. You're not allowed to talk about this stuff. But here was Russ Dizdar in particular. We went to a conference. I started listening to these guys on podcasts, okay? I had a job where I finally got a job working in the wilderness. And man, let me tell you, my life began to heal tremendously. I got out of the city. I got out of working in residential mental health centers, and I got out of working in city jobs down in Denver. And I began to get this job where I had an hour commute into the mountains, and I began to work at a wilderness therapy camp at 9,000 feet in elevation, a beautiful place called Gold Lake. And it was for 18 to 26-year-old guys whose family had a lot of money, but they had failure to launch, right? They had all of the things they needed to be successful in life, and yet they were bitter and miserable and drunk and high, or playing video games all their life. And they're like, hey, can you teach my young man how to be a man, or somebody like that? And anyways, it was my first opportunity to just go and be outside in nature. And man, let me tell you what happened when I was away from all the technology. It was like there was freedom for me, because all of those quiet pieces of my soul that had been suppressed and silenced, and for me, the hypervigilance that I have when I'm in a city, and this need to be situationally aware all of the engineers in the back of your brain that are working continually when you're in a high pressure environment, that suddenly can take a break, allow these other portions of your soul to step forward and begin to share what the heck is going on in there. And it began to give me this peace of mind and this solitude. And while I was in there, and while I was up there and driving back and forth this hour and a half drive every day, I began to listen to these guys who were preaching and talking in a way that was so inspiring. They were so bold. They were so courageous, and I needed that. I had been sissified in the church. Honestly, I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes here, but I had been given a very soft version of Jesus my entire life. I got to see this naked, neutered, defeated guy on a cross a lot. What I didn't see was a bold and ferocious warrior. I didn't see a brave and mighty man. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's this word in Hebrew called Gibborim. It's the mighty men of valor, like the warriors you read about with David and the men who are hiding with him in the caves of Adullam, like these guys who like Benaiah, who like go into a pit with a lion on a snowy day, the ones who like wrestle with blood and sweat and tears and fight for the innocent. Like I needed to see that. I needed to hear those guys standing on the front line, bellowing out deliverance, bellowing out the truth in face of the insurmountable odds of the kingdom of darkness, of these secret societies. They were still living stones. They were like unkillable. And I needed to see them. And so my wife and I went to a conference down in Colorado Springs that was called Prophecy in the News. And Russ Dizdar was speaking there. And I was there to see him. Full disclosure, I went through a lot of this whole like waking up process in the closet. I didn't tell my wife about none of this. I was like, she's gonna leave me. She's gonna think I'm crazy. All this stuff. We're all y'all. Anybody that wakes up to any of these level of conspiracies, I don't care what version of it you're at right now. You may be on a 1, you may be on a 7. Like Billy here, he's like smoking through the roof. He's barely cracking some of you into the things he's actually into. He's easing you in because a lot of you have so much cognitive dissonance. You can't handle the truth. You literally can't handle it. You've been so conditioned to believe a lie. And by believing that lie, your life is basically tolerable. But let me tell you something that will shake you down to your foundational core. The truth is terrifying. It is absolutely wonderful. And it is the most nightmarish thing. It is worse than anything you could ever imagine. Because when you have to look the truth in the face, it has flesh, it has bones, it has blood, it has eyes, it has a heartbeat. And those real people behind these things. There are real victims of this who have suffered in silence their entire life. And they never heard a single man get on a stage and talk about their life, talk about their purpose, talk about their healing, talk about their redemption. They never heard anybody mention them. We're the walking dead in the background of society, that the blood of our bodies has built these empires of evil. People are walking around now going, where did all these monsters come from? These psychopaths have been consuming the lives of children for generations in secrecy. But you know what? It was because I got to see somebody standing up on stage. And at that conference, we sat down, my wife and I, and she opens the brochure about all the speakers, and she sees Russ Dizdar, and his title was The Satanic Infiltration of the Church. And she said, that sounds terrifying. And I was like, we need to go. Because if you're scared of that, honey, boy, it's going to be really rough. You know what I'm saying? She was like, her eyes were as big as saucers. She sat down, and Russ Dizdar, if you guys never saw him in person before he passed, he's a big man. And let me tell you, he runs and guns like the best of them. He got up there and began to belt out the realities of this radical, intelligent evil and how the systems of darkness have been waging this war so strategically against mankind for so long. And he begins to describe what are called chosen ones. And this is what he started talking about chosen ones. These are people who are programmed, who are trained deliberately to assassinate, to kill, to traffic, to mule things around, to cause chaos, to be saboteurs, to infiltrate and destroy things. And he began to list off some of their traits. And let me tell you, it was like he was reading my resume. He started describing how they have these runner parts, these personalities that they can run and nobody can catch them, right? And my wife starts looking over at me as she starts to describe some of these things because she's heard me use these words like my runner. He starts describing how they'll always have knives strapped to their chest and razor blades in their shoes. And she's looking over at me again, and her eyes are getting bigger, and he's starting to describe these character traits of who I am. And I can see on her face, I'm watching her because I feel like for the first time in my life, my wife is going to see me for who I am and not the character of who I've been to her. And I'm trying to see whether or not she's going to leave me. Is she going to love me? Is she going to be scared of me? All of these thoughts are running through my head. And I'm starting to just pray for an opportunity to be able to explain to her, this is who I am. This is who I am. Like, do you still love me? Will you still love me? And she's going through this massive breakdown, as so many of you who have gone through these moments in your life where you realize the world that you once knew 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago has come crumbling down all around you. And you're suddenly getting answers to a question that nobody's been able to give you for your entire life. And Russ gave me that when he explained plainly what split personality program multiples are, how the enemy has been using Manchurian candidates to operate in this for so long, and how they can find a purpose, a mission, a motive that will help to fuel them out of it. And I knew I had a freedom that was waiting for me. I knew if this man was alive, he was a testimony to me that I could come out of it, that I could speak the secrets, that I could find freedom and restoration and healing in my own life. And you know what? That was the catalyst for me. That was the eureka moment that I needed in order to dive into the depths of those inky, vaporous pains from my past and start to unravel the mysteries of what my life had been.
How did your wife take it? I mean, at some point, obviously you had to come right out and say, honey, look, here's what happened to me. And obviously anybody that goes through that sort of thing, at least from my own experience, I mean, certainly not to the extent, not by any means to the extent that you had, when you come clean with certain things about the way you might have grown up, that is 180 degrees out of phase with anything you know they're familiar with, you got to have a little bit of concern, a little bit of trepidation. I know that I certainly did. How did she take it? I mean, how did you get through that? I mean, because obviously she thinks she married one person, and now all of a sudden she's realizing, oh snap, there's somebody else here. How did that unfold, and how did she take it?
You know, along the way, though, she began to see the other persons that were there. I changed my name. I started going by Nathan. I started going by Jason. I started wearing body armor all the time. I stopped associating with my other friends. I started wearing a lot of pistols and training firearms. I started getting really big into the prepping community. I got really big into that out in Colorado. Started digging stuff. I started burying stuff out in the woods and making preparations and getting keys to other houses. And I started doing a lot of sketchy stuff. You know, she started seeing this other side of me and was like, what is this? Who is this other man? Along the way, though, I was very apathetic towards her because that other side of me had no real relational meat we had no real heart in our relationship with her. And so she saw these other pieces of me. And I was kind of breadcrumbing her to try to get her to a place of understanding on some of who I was. And I'd started leaking out a little bit of this stuff, testing her. But ultimately, we came down to this showdown where we were sitting outside of my house, and I had to ask her, will she still love me? Will you still be with me no matter what I've got to tell you next? And that's one of those things a spouse doesn't want to hear, you know? That's probably way high on the checklist of things that make you like freaked out and squirm inside about things you don't want your spouse to sit down and tell you, you know? But I had to tell her, and I began to share with her some of this abuse that took place. And I mean, I came apart out there. I came undone, and I sobbed like I can't even start to describe to you. And you know what? She had in her eyes this heart of love that was so supernatural. She had a love for me and a compassion for me. And if anything, my wife she got understanding in a moment because she had been picking up. Women's intuition is so beyond ours as men. It's a very different kind of gift that they have. Their spiritual antenna are way more attuned. And she'd been picking up clues along the way for so long that just didn't fit. Something doesn't match here. And she had major disturbances about my grandfather and some of these people in my family that really bothered her from the beginning. And she saw a lot of strangeness. But now she suddenly had an understanding about what this was. And so for her, there was an absolute amount of love on one side towards me. And then there was anger. My wife was enraged. She was furious because she felt so betrayed, not by me, but by my family, and how they had been so duplicitous to her, how they had acted towards her and tried to kind of groom her into this lifestyle, into this relationship. Because let me put it super transparently, you're advantageous to the family. When you get brought into the families when you have children. And my wife and I had been barren. Part of the abuse that I suffered as a child was crushing on my epididymis to make me like a eunuch so that I couldn't have children. This is part of the Catholic tradition where they like these prepubescent boys to stay this way as long as possible. So they castrate them. And now they do it in a little different way, and in order to keep their youthfulness as long as possible and maintain this falsetto and soprano and this falsetto voice. And so for years of our marriage, I'd never been able to have that. Well, this when we did end up having children, that's the prerequisite to get into the family, because you've got to give one of your children over into it to get the trust fund, to get access to the phone book and the directory of favors. And so she had never been brought into that level of the family, and in no way, shape, or form would she have ever wanted to. But for her, that level of betrayal and hatred and rage was so palpable, because she couldn't believe that these people had been doing this in front of her face to me and trying to handle me and use me still, even as we were married, and she'd seen this now. And so for her, it was an opportunity to extend love towards me. And over the course of especially the first couple months, she tried to really extend that towards me. And then she went through hell. Let me just put it transparently, because my family and it turned to war really fast. It was violent, it was nasty, and it turned disgusting really quickly. And she got to see that Christian mask come peeling off of the face of my family, and these other people show up. And we were in a fight for our lives, and no intents and purposes. And this is what I share in the beginning of the book, what it's like to have these people come after you, what it's like to have people who have dependent upon secrecy turn against you because you're the one who's coming out to speak against them. And we got to see the power of the Most High to deliver us and ransom us and give us an opportunity to come out and to speak the truth.
Nathan, I got to know, usually when people speak about these types of things, there was a banker, I think he was from Switzerland or something like that. And it wasn't long ago. My man came out, told everybody, in order to get into the upper echelons, they start you off, it seems, just a real ballin' party. The who's are there. Everybody's there. It's all cool. Then you go to another party afterwards. And then it gets a little seedier. There's some things that might be a little bit questionable. And then maybe a month later, they got another party, and then it starts getting crazier and crazier. And then finally, he was made the offer, hey, if you really want to hit with the big hitters, hey, you're going to have to do some awful things to kids, and that's what it's going to be. Well, he, along with a number of others, have obviously come up dead. Now, here you are talking to me, talking to other people about these things that the powers that shouldn't be don't want heard. What attempts how has this worked out for you, man? I mean, obviously, these people would not just be okay with you talking about this stuff. I mean, what attempts have been? I know that you speak of one in the book that I got to, and it sounded pretty doggone harrowing with your wife. How does that unfold, and how do you get on the other side of it? Because it seems to me that these people would never stop.
In some ways, I'll say this. There's a cost of coming out and speaking the truth. And you know what? You do. On one side, I really believe, at the end of the day, here's what it came down to. I really believed there was either we were going to die, period, because there's two options to get out of this cult. You either join along with it, you go along with it and stay along with it until you're all the way through. Because what all this came down to, you guys, I had a surgery to try to repair some of the damage that had happened to me. And a while after that, my wife got pregnant. And for us, that was the turning point. That was the moment where we had to decide whether or not we were going to go along with the plan and give our child over to my grandfather and let him have access to her. They give basically legal guardian rights over to the family in order to do this stuff. Whether we would go along with that or we'd come out of it. And, at the same time, when I was coming into reading and hearing a lot about these people like Michael Lake and all these other people, I really had to believe that either the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was still real, that there was still a judge of all the earth and somebody that you could call upon to deliver you and ransom you and rescue you, who was the sovereign, who could stop radical evil in its places. And if he was not, then we were going to die. But you know what? I was going to die trying to protect my family as best as I could. And so over the course of that summer, when I did come out to my family and I began to talk to them, and initially I tried to extend forgiveness to them, because that's what I found to be a lot of the cure for me, was starting to get out of this bitterness, this prison that I had been for so long in my life. And I tried to extend a form of forgiveness for the best part of what I had known that had taken place and what I saw in the reaction. In one way, let me just tell you right now, when people respond early on, when we start to talk about this stuff, it's going to clue you into how many other skeletons are still in the closet that they don't want talked about. And it became very clear that my family had a lot worse skeletons still going on, that they didn't want this coming out. And so it turned into a really big back and forth between him and me, my dad and I, and my family members and I, and people starting to come after to us. And literally like this story of what I talked about in the book was a week after I tried to have the last phone call I ever had with my mother, asking for my genealogy and my heraldry records. And I talked to her about the Knights of Columbus and what my grandpa was doing down there. And it was like, it was on, because they knew I was out and I didn't want any way back in. And so my wife and I went to see a movie. We went out of the theater that night. And like I told you all before, man, I was packing an arsenal all the time. I was hyper vigilant continually, because I also understood there's a part of me that doesn't want to give up the old ways, which is running and gunning, and I had a formidable amount of experience of warfare, and I knew that sooner or later there was going to be a showdown. And I stood out of this theater. It's like 11 o'clock at night, and when we walked out of the theater, there's only a couple of cars in the parking lot, one right there in front of the doors, and ours was further out. And all of a sudden a car started angling towards us, completely away from the normal path of traffic. And there was a man and a woman in the car. And as they got closer to us, I had this just overwhelming, that sickening feeling. If you've ever felt murderous intent, if you've ever been around it, people cannot hide that and conceal that. It comes like a wave and all the hackles go up. And I just prayed, like, help us get out of here. And as this car came towards us, a man and a woman were in there, and the woman on the passenger side raised up a pistol and pointed it out the window towards my wife and I. And as she went to press the trigger, we started trying to move off of that and began to try to run towards that car. And as she raised that pistol up to fire, it failed to fire. It did not fire. And she dropped the pistol down and began to try to clear that malfunction. And as they got closer and closer, she continued to mess with the weapon and try to get it back in action. As much as she tried, she could not do it. And the car eventually, as it got to us, stopped and then kind of went around us and kept going the other way. And so I started trying to run towards our car, my wife and I. And I mean, she was 7 months pregnant at the time. I mean, it was life or death for us. This was like that moment. And a truck came by coming towards us from the other direction. And a man rose up out of the back of the truck with a rifle in his hands, and he pointed that weapon at us. And as well, the same thing happened as he began to try to pull the trigger. The weapon failed to fire, and we just continued to make our way running towards it. And he continued to try to clear it. And then the truck peeled out and took off. And so I got my wife and I in the vehicle, and we began to take off out of the back part of the parking lot, the same direction that my wife came in. And as we were leaving, a third guy came out, and he had a gun in his hand, a black gun in his hand. It looked just like a Glock. And he was running in front of my vehicle within 20 yards of me. All he had to do was turn and fire. But as he turned towards me, there was a look in his eyes. His eyes were pinned, and they were as big as they had ever been. And he had a dread in his face, like he had seen the most terrifying thing in all of creation. He was terrified and running away from me as fast as he could. And as my wife drove away from there, she's shaking, I'm shaking. And we realized at the end of the day, this had been one of those moments where we had been delivered from death. And he had done it in a supernatural way. So where I did not have to fire a shot, I had not had to raise myself up to try to stop this and physically fight back. But he had given me deliverance from that. And let me tell you, that wasn't the only time of when people have come and tried to make a deliberate attempt or assassination on my life. We have had other times where the Father's literally made us invisible to people who walk in, raided out, ready to kill, and yet he has stopped us. We've had our phones jammed and people coming into stores looking after us, and we've been able to get out and get past them without anybody coming after us. We have had miraculous moments of deliverance and protection over these years. And you know what? I do not believe that's because of my tradecraft. I don't believe that's because I have some skill set. I have some skills, but let me tell you, I came out publicly. The second you come out publicly, it's a totally different story. All of my skill set was be gray, be anonymous, disappear, go hide in the woods and be nothing. But I came out here to try to be a living witness to others, that they can come out, they can speak the truth, and that there is a defender of the orphans and the fatherless and the victims. It says in the book of Isaiah, there's these survivors who are sent out as witnesses to the nations, the one who experience these abominations, these things they do in secret. Like it says, where they're eating this filthy abominations in the gardens and in the groves. It's people that survive this ritualistic abuse. He literally prophesied that they would be sent out as witnesses to the nation. So on one side, I believe we literally are living in times and generations where the witnesses and these survivors of these things are going to come forth, and they cannot silence us all. They cannot kill us all. And I believe on one side, there is also the season of the revelation of the beast, where they are no longer hiding a lot of this. They no longer are going after and killing anybody that comes out and talks about this stuff. However, if you still keep one of your feet in the doors of that kingdom, If you still go ahead and stick yourself in that world and you don't come fully out of it, you open a door to be destroyed. And unfortunately, some of these people who have come out to try to speak about these things, they do not understand the complexities of spiritual warfare. They do not arm themselves and equip themselves with the mindset that you need in order to walk in obedience, in holiness, so that you close down the doors of the enemy that open up legal rights for the enemy to come after you and destroy you and your family. And so those things are imperative for those of you that are trying to come out and speak about these things. It's imperative for people that are trying to do counter trafficking work to understand why the cartels are so effective, because they're engaged in this very type of witchcraft to kill and to silence and to send out spirits to deceive. There is a real spiritual war that takes on human flesh that wages these battles, but there is a real supremacy in the kingdom of righteousness that can protect you no matter what. They can send an entire army like they did in Elisha, and he can blind the entire army and defend you. He still lives, and he still protects his people. When he says so, you live. When he says so, you die.
Well, it's clear we ain't going to get into permaculture today, bro. We're going to have you back for another one. I mean, I think it's important, though, that we set the stage, because everything that we're doing, at the end of the day, it's imperative for my wife and I, especially as we do all the stuff in our farm and our YouTube channel and all the other media that we do, is that we try to glorify the Almighty in all of this. But man, right now there's this insidious thing that's going on with these kids. They're coming up missing. I mean, they're talking about the latest thing that went on, but still nobody's ever explained where all the kids in Hawaii went. I don't know where they went. Nobody's talking about where they went. They just kind of move on to the next thing, and everybody forgets about it. But you got people like you mentioned a moment ago, Russ Dizdar, Steve Quayle, Doug Hagman, Fritz Springmeier wrote Bloodlines of the Illuminati, and talks a great deal about these families you were discussing a moment ago, where it's right there in plain sight if you only choose to look at it. The information's out there. Nathan, I'm going to swing it a little bit away from you, because, like I said, we're going to have to get you on and talk more about permaculture, because we haven't even, folks, we're just not going to get into it today. At least you'll have a background of where Nathan's coming from. And I got to believe that permaculture journey has got to be at least a part of your healing. But I got to ask you, man, because you have a background and you have an understanding in a lot of these things that clearly a lot of us don't. What in your mind, or maybe you have experience from this, these kids, unbelievable numbers are coming up missing. Where are they going? Do you have an opinion or any thoughts on this?
Absolutely. You got to understand something. You're describing a little bit of what these insidious underworld parties look like. And I'll say this right now. They're not eyes wide shut style parties. They're not glamorous. These rings of trafficking do not look pretty ever. But the most common pedophile that I ever experienced and was a part of was a normal looking guy, a middle-aged man. There was nothing special, powerful, or extreme about a lot of them. But these children are being used systemically. They get sorted out. Let me put it really quickly. If they already have a history of this, like one of the things my family looks for, they work through the foster system to adopt children who have been sexually abused predominantly, as a way of already acquiring like a broken stud. This is how they would put it. They want one that's already broken, so they don't have to do the refracturing, the traumatizing, all the rest of that stuff. It's already preconditioned. There's scorings of the glass so that it'll crack along the lines that they already want in place. So you'll see so much of this infestation of child exploitation coming out of the very agencies who are tasked with being the place that helps to look after these like the National Centers for Missing and Exploited Children. There's a lot of people who are placed within these organizations to skew the numbers so that, like you said, the conversations are never actually had, that people can't truly identify how many children are actually going missing every year. You gave an example of one instance where hundreds or thousands of children, depending on what sources you're going to read, in Hawaii disappear. And people are not discussing that. That's because there's an open secret there that they're trying to cover up. But truly, these children get funneled into the world where they are exploited. And so this can be for a few different factors. On one, you do have the pedophilia side of this. On another side, you do have a human slavery side of this, where a child is going to be brought in to be used as a slave in a form of industry or business that may not necessarily be sexually oriented, but it's still going to be an area where they're used. Denver, Colorado, where I was from for a good half of my life, was the number 2 human trafficking network capital in the United States, one of the most in the world. And so anywhere where you have cross intersections, where you have interstates coming from both sides, north, south, and east, west, you have major human trafficking hubs. But those children are getting pushed into the funnels of this industry, of this system. And so many of them are literally becoming products for snuff film. If you guys don't know what snuff porn is, it's people that are getting sexual pleasure from the death of other people, torture and abuse of children. This is a very serious industry. This is where billions of dollars of appetites are used up, and these children are genuinely consumed, devoured, and destroyed. And I'm not talking about some kind of ethereal thing. I'm talking about physically consumed, and their lives are destroyed, and they are left like the walking dead. They do not ever surface again because they're disposed of. They are disposed of. But the Reynolds family, they own 60% of the moratoriums. Back in the 90s, their big business was crematoriums. They burned up and got rid of a lot of the evidence of what took place there. They also own a lot of pig farms where they would dispose of the bodies after the fact as well. And it was an incredibly horrific world. But let me tell you, this is the underculture of our society. And there is a dire need for us to raise awareness on one side, on others, for those that are raising funding to try to drive and deliver people out of this. But there's a need for underground railroads, for refuge railroads, where they can find healing and restoration and deliverance, because that's what I needed. I needed a house of hope. I needed somebody to extend that hand towards me. But back then, where the heck was that? Those people were terrified of this stuff. You want to mention any level of abuse, sexual abuse, male abuse, sodomy, or anything else, this is so stigmatized and so avoided. This is a hot topic that nobody wants to touch, let alone the fact that it might be taking place in someone's church is so just disheveling to them that they don't even want to think about it. And so they go and put their heads back in the comfortable sands of ignorance, and they look the other way, which is what allows a predator to continue to come and put on a sheepskin, while inwardly they are this ravenous wolf that is devouring the flock. It says they go and seek out lambs to consume. He's talking about the children. This has been going on from time immemorial, and it's continually the pedocracy, this access to power in our culture, is done through the sexual exploitation and the abuse and misuse of children. This has been going on forever. And it's only the illusion that we have been given that we have an amoralistic society where the people at the top are good Christian people. But lately we're starting to see that veil is thinning, and we're starting to identify that it's psychopaths who promote psychopaths in order to grow this system of corporatocracy so that they can enslave us and encircle us. But these people are mutually compromised. They have mutually assured destruction because they have gone in the back rooms and they've had sex with 12-year-old girls. And that's all it takes. You do that and that gets documented. Now they have a way of keeping the lid on you for the rest of your life. But we need people who are radically committed to coming out and exposing these things and revealing just where those children are going, because we need them to come out and speak the truth.
Man, I'm praying for it all the time, Nathan. I mean it every single time my wife and I pray, man. It's like, we pray that these kids are brought to safety and the people responsible are brought to justice, no matter the cost, no matter the rank. And speaking of rank, man, I'm starting to wonder, not starting. I mean, I don't know why I said it that way. I have long suspected that all of the people up and down these levers of power are probably, I'm going to ask you a question that maybe you're not qualified, or maybe you are qualified to answer. I don't know. But all of a sudden, everybody, Ghislaine Maxwell supposedly goes to jail. That's what they're telling us. I mean, I haven't seen any legit videos that is happening. Jeffrey Epstein supposedly is off who knows where. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he isn't. Maybe he's got a new face living somewhere. We have people like that were in England, Jimmy Savile. Right-hand man with the whole royal family, and all of a sudden, he's dead. The guy looked like a freaking pedophile. Then you got everybody that seems to be, boy, they sure talk a big game before they get into politics. And then all of a sudden, they're doing everything that's diametrically opposed to their constituents. How many people all up and down to this chain? I mean, do you have an opinion on that? How many of these people do you think in these levers of power that are absolutely positively controlled by this whole network that you're talking about? Or how many do you think are even involved with it?
I think the best way to really ascertain that without going in and trying to identify each and every one of these people is to know them by their fruits. Ultimately, that's how you sniff out what the wolves really are. Because when somebody who, like you said, they have this very strong opinion about a lot of these topics, and they say they're going to do these certain things, and then when they get into the position of power that would allow them the ability to do that, and they don't, this is ultimately because somewhere along the line they are compromised, systemically compromised. And I truly believe, I know it's a disheartening reality to see, but I believe that they are, in the vast majority of circumstances, they are compromised themselves. It's not to say that every single one of them is participants within the system. However, those levers of power are so inextricably linked into our criminal justice system that, like, they have designed a system. Let me explain something to you about the founding of our country and who a lot of the architects of our country really were. They tried to formulate a lot of these secret societies, had a vision called the New Atlantis, written by Francis Bacon, where they envisioned a land where they could create freedom for the secret societies to operate with the freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech. It was not so that righteous people could maintain those ethics and maintain those moralities. That was what was utilized for a lot of those years. But the ultimate goal was to take and destroy people's morality, their ability to resist evil, and instead make a place for evil, to facilitate evil, like the Church of Satan, who says now we have to have mandatory instruction lessons on Satanism in the schools. We need to have after school programs for Satanism. We need to legislate and legalize the rights of Satanists to have their access to children. We want people to be able to have abortions, like in the state of New Mexico right now. Like they're writing articles on how to do a satanic ritual while you do your abortion. This is public, big magazines who are publishing these articles. The rise of these occult marketing is coming forward right now, and that's because they have infiltrated every little mechanism here. And so much of this comes from the Jesuit ideology, this formations of how secret societies maintain rings within rings of power, so that the left hand really doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And yet the bird, this great phoenix of America, seems to always fly in the same direction, no matter who is the person or the political power at the top. These agendas still carry on. That's because you have a force of individuals who are far more powerful, that you and I do not know their names. You and I do not know their identities by and far. And yet they are facilitating radical, intelligent evil. Like Alfred Kinsey, a guy who did all of these sex experiments back at University of Indiana. He had pedophiles, many pedophiles. Like a guy named Rex King was one of them. You want to talk about one of the worst people, who chronicled and journaled over 1,000 documented rapes of children. This was submitted as scientific literature and is used to this day when you want to go and get justice for sexual abuse as a child or being committed on you. They use those reports written by Alfred Kinsey, who believed that pedophilia was normal and that nobody should be stigmatized against it. They use those reports to this day to give your perpetrator an evaluation on how severe his punishment should be, based off of Rex King, the very pedophile, off of his documentation of how abused children are during the course of these perpetrations of these crimes. This is the level of systemic evil that has taken place over all of these years. One of my favorite authors who chronicles a lot of this, a great historian. Oh, I covered this up because I got children around. Anyways, it's called The Eaters of Children, The Pedocracy Exposed, and is written by a guy named Johnny Cerrucci. For those of you that want to dive into understanding who is who and where do these people come from, listen, read a book. Let me tell you, just read a book. This is one. It's called The Pedocracy Exposed. This is a statue over in Europe that's right there. Oh, this is a podcast. My bad. Anyways, Johnny Cerrucci, you guys, Johnny Cerrucci, resistancerising.com. He has a lot of books that go through a lot of the details of the mechanics of where these systems come from, their origins of it, and why these seemingly the most powerful people in the world are obsessed with this, why it's this way and has been this way for so long, and what is it going to take in order to break that cycle. And in my opinion, how I'm waging that war now is on the side of advocacy, awareness, yes, but also on what are the methods to get healing and restoration into individuals so that they can be restored, so they can have a purpose and a mission and a calling, so they can help to set other captives free, because ultimately we need each other's stories. It says the enemy, the dragon, the devil of old, is defeated by the blood of the Lamb, the words of our testimony, and not loving our lives when faced with death. We need people who have been cured from the fear of death, who've been cured from the fear of man, who fear the face of no man, who will never compromise. And you know what? When we have that type of boldness and courage, it will inspire those who need to come out of that kingdom of darkness to become double agents, to turn on their captors, to turn on those who have compromised and begin to expose them in every arena where they've done their evil.
I got to say, man, when I was looking into the work of Johnny Cerrucci, man, it blew my ever-loving mind when I found out the full depth of who really is calling the shots. You know, it's not, you know, everybody says Rothschild and this and that. Well, because of Johnny Cerrucci, I'm now aware of other names like the Aldo Brandinis, oh, shoot, man, there's a whole list of them that dwarf anybody you think you know and think you heard of, the people that are behind the people that are behind the people that go, I mean, as far up the chain as that we know. And I can only imagine who's at the very top of it. And you also hit into another part that I've been really reluctant to discuss on this show. And you were talking about some of the occult beginnings of America, which most people do not know. When you look at Sir Francis Bacon, the New Atlantis, and his work, and you look at, you know, a lot of people suspected that that was really William Shakespeare. And I really get the arguments as to how it almost certainly could have been. And you look at the founding fathers, you look at people like Jefferson, you look at Ben Franklin, the Hellfire Club. And, you know, it was because of, a lot of people don't know this, but the design of Washington, there's a reason why it's called the capital city. It was after the Capitoline city in Rome. And it's basically a pantheon of all the Roman gods. And most people don't know that. These are conversations that up until now, I'll be honest with you, Nathan, I've been reluctant to even talk about, but you kind of opened that can of worms a little bit. And it's so far down the rabbit hole that I'm afraid I'm going to lose people if I really tell them the full extent of how these things began, because it might make people think to a certain extent that there isn't any hope, that this ball has been rolling for so long that good night. What can we do? Well, it's all written. Look, we're going to know how it ends because it's all written right there in Revelation. And at the end of the day, man, good night, man. Greater is he that is in me than he that is in this world. And man, it's been such a joy to have on you. I got one more question, Nathan, before we good night, man. I could probably talk to you for 5 hours, because when just bringing up Johnny Cerrucci and American occult origins, dude, we can go on for another 5 hours with, I could probably fill volumes with what's in my cabeza right now regarding what you just said a moment ago. But people, I don't think, are just ready for that. We'll have to do that in subsequent episodes. But I got to ask, because I really never thought about this part of it until, I'm going to take you back a little bit. I brought up Ghislaine Maxwell. You were talking about these people that get together. You know, you try to hit up your mom about this thing, and then she disowns you. At least that's my understanding of it. How many, we always talk about and we hear about guys involved in this thing, but you got that one lady who was doing basically, who was linked up with the Clintons. I can't think of her name right now. She's an older lady, but looked 20, 25 years younger than what she should have been. Oh my goodness, I can't think of her name, but that's not important right now. I'm just curious, how many women are mixed up in this?
You know, this is the big question that has puzzled me for a long time too, and has always been, I think there is a very real Black Widow society that is behind a lot of these men, to just put it super transparently, and they're a lot better at keeping it quiet. They're a lot better at keeping it suppressed. And so for many years, this has been one of those struggles, is trying to identify that, because it's easier for us to find a lot of the evidence of the men who are participants in this. It's a lot harder for us to identify the women who are participants of this. And I think on one side, there may not be as anywhere near as high of an instance of women being the people in those positions. But I think that it's just ultimately not been exposed powerfully in the same way. It's not been exposed or brought to the light in as much. And in I can't speak to it because I don't know. I've not been able to figure that out. Ultimately, I've found some women in positions of power that are truly spies in their own way, but what I've not seen is that same form of the esoteric occult side of it. And that's maybe just on one side because I was raised very separately from that, and so it never came across my lens, for all intents and purposes. But it's a really good question that I think is predicated on a lot of the survivors on the female side of it who are able to come forward. And I know some have and shared more about that, and those, like you mentioned, one like Kathy O'Brien earlier, and others who have talked about some of this. But it's a really good question. I don't think I can actually give you a substantive answer to.
See, I'm wondering because we know about Ghislaine Maxwell, or at least we think we do to a certain extent. She's obviously had to have been on every horror. Her dad was oh shoot, oh good night. I can't even think of this guy's name right now, but his last name obviously was Maxwell. It was a made up name. Good night, man. But he was basically a media mogul, and some people think he got smoked, or maybe he was taken out. He was snuffed out one way or the other, found drowned off his boat called the Lady Ghislaine, by the way. And Robert Maxwell, that's who it was. Big time. I mean, the guy could literally walk into the White House anytime he wanted, unannounced. He had that kind of power. And we see these things, like Fritz Springmeier talks about, these bloodlines, all these crazy things that go on, things that are really unbelievable to most people. Nathan, before I said that was going to be one of the last questions, but I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't ask you, what on earth? There's a lot of parents out there that are listening to this podcast, and there's a lot of people late going into work today because they're not just going to turn this off. They got to hear the conclusion of it. What can so many people do to keep an eye on their kids these days? I mean, that seems like a rhetorical question, but I got to ask it from somebody who's seen this belly of the beast from as inside of place as you can possibly be. How do they protect their kids? What is the best way to go about it? How do you do it?
Man, great question. First and foremost, just don't give your children to strangers. Fundamentally, one of the most critical things you can, and if you're not there right now because you've already got your children enrolled in compulsory public education, whatever format of it is, please understand, you teach your children fundamentals like don't talk to strangers. You teach them some of these basics of how to keep themselves safe early on in life. You have to make them aware of evil exists in the world as early as you really can, and you need to make sure that they understand how to communicate what happens to their body. They need to be able to communicate what's going on with their body, and you need to build as much as you can a relationship of trust with your child to, first of all, to be able to communicate about these things. But you must understand that there are very intelligent predators who groom people. If you've never taken any time out of your life to study grooming behaviors, if you've never studied it, please take some time to equip yourself with some of that knowledge so that you're not ignorant of the schemes of a predator. But let me assure you of this. Predators like to have access to children. That is why they are there. And you must know that they are in our schools. They are in the gym classes. They are coaches. They are referees. They are people that have access to children around them. One of the fundamental best ways to keep your children safe is to not let them outside of your parental supervision until they're capable of discerning these things for themselves, communicating and defending themselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, to be able to discern other people. For me and my family, this is why we ended up selling our house and moving into an RV and going on the road, because I wanted my family near me. I wanted to be able to travel to places like I'd seen all my life and hoped for, living on homesteads, living on farms, regenerative agriculture. I wanted to live this lifestyle, but I also wanted my children to experience the skills of life so that they could be competent and capable young men and young women. I wanted them to have that as a gift. I wanted to give my life up, give the
give the prestige and the power and the wealth away for them to know an authentic life. Like my children have been with me ever since they were born. I've been with my family now for 7 years. You know, I have worked very hard by the sweat of my face to eat bread like a migrant worker, just so that my children could be with me. So I didn't have to enroll them in daycare. So I didn't have to drop them off at the school, at the elementary school. I wanted them near me. I knew fundamentally that's the safest place they can be, is at their mother's side. I want them there with us. And many parents get conditioned. They get conditioned to divorce themselves from those attachments. They ship their children off to somebody else to raise them, because when you raise a child in a city, you feel like they're a burden. When you raise your child in the country or on a farm, you understand that they are burden bearers, they're helpers, they are assets, they're invaluable. You suddenly want more children. And this is one of those beautiful fruits of, if you go back to that lifestyle that you get to enjoy, is your children are co-laborers with you. They help you. They become benefactors for you in life. But when they are kind of trapped in the rat race of life, they really feel like a burden. And I understand the desire to dump them off, to get a break from them, to get away from them. But giving your children over to sleepovers and slumber parties and trips overnight at school, you're giving access to an opportunity for a predator to devour your child. You really are. Sleepovers are one of the highest chances your child has of getting sexualized at an early age, whether it's seeing it physically in front of their face or having abuse being done and enacted on them. It's one of the highest instances of when children are exposed to sexual content, explicit sexual content, through their eyes or being done to them, is over at sleepovers. It's also inside of a lot of these child systems like daycare. When you drop your child off at the church and they have their own church daycare, listen, if you have not vetted out these people personally, don't give them your children. They are your inheritance. They are your arrows in your hand. You are supposed to watch over them. You've been entrusted with these precious little lambs. You need to be a ferocious shepherd to them and understand, yes, good people that you think are good are inwardly disgusting, perverse people. And if you don't actually know them, you don't have any business turning your children over to them, nor do you have any business of anybody else telling you that you're required to do so. If they are, you need to get away from them. And I'm not joking. I have lived with people who have unplugged their family from those systems and have moved into travels and in travel trailers, RVs, and tents, who have gone and have left everything to just keep their family safe. And you know what? They are breaking a generational cycle of abuse. They are granting their children freedom from oppression and perversion, because abuse at an early age has such a long lasting effect. But let me tell you, there is good news, even if that's already taken place in your life, if that's already happened to other children, your children. There can be healing, there can be restoration, but let me tell you, it is an arduous, brutal, miserable road that often leads to major amounts of drug use, suicides, and death. Let me tell you, there is a spiritually transmitted disease, and people need deliverance from that. And we need deliverance from apathy. As fathers, predominantly, we need to be delivered from apathy like Adam had in the garden, so that we would instead be shepherds who confront the enemy and drive them from our midst. And whether that's us in the mirror and dealing with our own addictions and strongholds that we have, or whether that's the monsters that's outside of the camp, outside of our gates, we have a duty to guard and protect our children with a ferocity and intensity, so that it shows them we love them. Love is protection. Love is provision. This is how we show that we love them. We obey our Father's commands, and we look after these children with zealousness again.
That's what I'm talking about, brother. Man, start strong, finish strong. Nathan, where can they find you, bro?
Yes, they can go to snatchedfromtheflames.com. I've got my book there, an ebook, an audio book, signed copies available. I also have an audio recording of the entire scriptures. That's where my identity was rebuilt and restored from, and where you will find your identity as well. You can also go to youtube.com/Nathan Reynolds. I share my journey for the past 6 years, from my very first documentary talking about this to our journey on the road, living a mobile lifestyle, getting into regenerative agriculture, becoming an apprentice on a lot of these farms, permaculture farms, and learning this incredible skill set and farming and butchering. Man, I love artisanal butchering. Gosh dang it. One of those good skill sets for a knife guy. You know what I'm saying? Anyways, we share all those journeys. We share about fresh milled flour, because that darn near saved our lives too. And natural fibers and cold plunging and foraging. We got all kinds of crazy stuff on there as well. I mean, really into knives and swords. We got all kinds of crazy content on there, you guys. I've been talking about this stuff for years. There's a lot of people are finding it right now. Like, how is your YouTube not there? Listen, it's still there while it's there. Otherwise, I also have Rumble at the Linen Railroad and TikTok at Snatched from the Flames. So I appreciate you having me on, Billy. It's absolutely fantastic to get to talk with you, sir.
Man, it's been a real joy. You got to come back, bro. We didn't even touch the permaculture because I got to believe that that's part of the whole healing process, y'all. I just wanted you to hear, and trust me, you've only heard a tip of the iceberg of what Nathan's been through. It's an incredible story. I just wanted to whet your beak right now. We're going to have him back. We're going to talk a little bit more about his story, and next time we're going to get into permaculture. Y'all, I want to thank Nathan. I want to thank all of you for, well, obviously, I want to apologize, first of all, for making you late for work. And I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, y'all, stay alert, stay alive.